Oh, there goes my guy.
What's going on, brother? How you
You doing,
doing?
man?
What's up, sir? How are you doing?
Not bad, not bad.
The incomparable. Huh?
uh,
I see my brother just joined.
you know what? Oh, where your brother did?
Yeah, my brother. You know he's a social worker too.
Yeah, I
And
knew
he's a
that.
Virgo. A social worker and a Virgo.
Hey, clearly he's got a lot of stuff going for him.
How you doing, man? You look great. Okay. All right.
My AirPods were acting funny, so
Yo, the AirPods are crazy with the IG Live, but yeah, I finally figured out how to get them going. Oh man, good to see you, brother. This is
good to see
like
you, man.
this is perfect for me.
Yo,
Yeah, man.
how's life down? How's life in Florida now, man?
Life in Florida is great. It's it's different, you
Yeah.
know. Their winter is like 65 degrees, right? At its peak. But yeah. Okay, I see a lot of people joining.
I
Of
see.
course
All
they're
right.
gonna of course they're gonna join.
I'm seeing a couple of familiar faces. What's going on, people?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Wow. Brother, so listen, man, this is it, right? Like, just a quick like intro, like Kenton Kirby, the incomparable, one of my dear friends, one of the most solid people when it comes to this work. Um, just who he is and like his commitment and his like, his willingness to just really create community, to bring other folks into the fold when it comes to like identifying people who are really committed to supporting the healing journey of other folks, specifically young people of color and young men of color, particularly who've been impacted by various forms of violence. Um, Kenton is one of the first people I met when I moved back down to New York. Um, and he welcomed me with open arms. Everybody kept telling me that I needed to meet this brother Kenton and Sean. They was like, y'all two were like attached to the hip. And then I met this brother and I was just like, wow, this brother he's really about it. And you know, I'm just excited to be able to have this conversation with you. Kenton is actually the reason why I am connected to Men Healing, which is indicative of like his commitment to making sure that people get put on. What up, Sean?
Yeah, I see Sean there
Um,
too. What's going on, Sean?
and so, yeah, this is a new effort for Men Healing. This is an opportunity for us to really engage the social media world. This is a part of the 90,000 90-day campaign, with our effort to really raise $90,000 for the purpose of making sure that any male survivor who's experienced sexual harm or violence can have access to the amazing services that Men Healing provides. And this is an opportunity for us to just really showcase like all of the amazing people that are connected to Men Healing. And one of those people is Kenton Kirby. Um, Kenton is the director of practice at the Center for Court Innovation, co-founder of Make It Happen. That's where you and I connected. Come to your spot in Brooklyn. I was in Brooklyn at the time, and the brother just welcomed me with open arms. So I'm gonna stop talking because I want you to tell a little bit more about the work that you do, um, and even how the work that you do connects to the work of Men Healing.
All right. Well, Rich, thanks for having me, man. I'm appreciative of having this conversation with anyone except but you. So I'm loving this. Love seeing your face. So just in short, I'll be brief. Kenton Kirby, I've been in the field for maybe close to 20 years, maybe about 20 years total. Um, Worked in child welfare, worked in substance abuse. I've worked in the courts in a number of different settings, in a number of different capacities. And, you know, over the course of my career, I've always been in contact with folks that, one, were in some form of crises,
Mm,
two, felt that they weren't being heard,
mm,
and also as a practitioner myself in the beginning, I actually did cause a lot of harm because I was just doing my job. And so my lessons learned and looking back at that was I noticed I was always getting to like a stuck point with someone. Like we couldn't move beyond, that line of this is the scope of my job. This is what I'm supposed to do here. And I realized I was not thinking about the entire person, not even just myself as an entire, like as an individual. I was more than the job. I was a human who wanted to not help, support folks, because helping is kind of this like hierarchical thing. Like I'm helping you because I'm better than you, as opposed to I'm walking with you through this. And so that's kind of informed how I approach the work. When I met you, wow, that was like 6-7 years ago in Brooklyn. I was running that program, working with boys and men impacted by violence. So young folks who may have caused harm themselves, may have been harmed, but in the end, they're healing. They all deserve an opportunity for healing. And so a lot of my practice, a lot of my work in my day job was really around creating healing opportunities for folks that we initially wanted to define them by their most vulnerable moment, right? And because we're defining them by the most vulnerable moment, the young folks, the people that we're working for, they're also assessing us and they're saying, you know what, this is not a safe place for me. So you know what, I'm going to say all the things I need to say to just get out of your office so you can sign my form so I can just be out of here, as opposed to, oh, this person's showing up. And so I really use my own past experiences, being someone who did the work in that box, and realized I'm like, there's got to be more. You've got to join with folks. You've got to lead with curiosity with the people that you're working for, regardless of what kind of harm that they're presenting with you. Because at the end of the day, there's so many other layers of harm and things and challenges that so many of the folks that we are lucky enough to work for have experienced. So I'll stop there. Well, actually, I'm on a mental healing facilitator team. These weekends are so transformative for the men, but also for the facilitators. I come out of those weekends exhausted, but fulfilled. It's like filled, like not just like I learned a lot about myself in those weekends, which is beautiful.
Yeah. Wow, bro. So like, I don't know. I'm just like the type of person that always likes to blow people up and like big people up, man. So if y'all don't know, like Kenton's been doing this so long, especially in the like violence interruption and kind of like the credible messenger space, and the work that he's been doing is so like on the ground, so like most importantly connected to the people and finding the people in spaces where a lot of folks may not want to, invest that time and energy. And Kenton is one of the people that's there. Kenton's also one of the people that's like really committed to helping other people develop those skills, right? Yeah. To do the things that you just described. And so, it's important for me to just like make sure I give you your flowers, brother, because you've been doing this for a while, and I know you're doing this not because like you just had this epiphany one day and you said that you wanted to be like a social worker and help, right? You do this because you also have your own lived experiences. Do you want to talk about some of that, like some of that drove you to this work and like, that led you to a place where you had the humility that you just described? Because what I heard just now was humility. And one of the things that I've often emphasized with anybody who want to work in the community is like, you got to have that humility to say that I don't know what you're going through, even though I've been through some things myself, but I'm humble enough to like open myself and be receptive to hearing where you're at so I can then figure out the best way that I can support you.
Yeah. I mean, I always, it's funny. My brother's on here too. And he's a Scorpio. So his birthday's coming up. So I always say, my life trajectory growing up, various losses and challenges and all types of things in my life. The one thing I will say is what helped, people took a chance on you. People did what was right, not necessarily what they felt was in the scope of their jobs or like what they couldn't do. It was let me do what's right.
Mm-hmm.
And when folks took those chances on me coming up, as opposed to doing what was in the scope of their job, I could have gone a completely different direction as a young person. But these opportunities that folks, by taking a chance on me, just for the sake of me being a human being, a person out in this world, deserving those opportunities, I was able to do what I could with it. So professionally, when I decided, okay, what was I going to do coming up? I said, I need to pay it forward, because those folks that took those shots on me just because of with a big head when I was a kid. I had a really big head when I was a kid. To take those chances on me,
Still got a big head.
I still got a big head, right? But it was one of those things where I could never like pay those people back how they paid. So I'm like, I committed myself to paying it forward. And so everything I do in my career and my life is about paying it forward. And social work is the field that fit that for me. You know, so, I mean, I mentioned earlier, professionally in my role, I did a lot of things I wasn't necessarily like, I look back, I'm like, damn, I really wasn't necessarily proud of those things professionally, but I'm also aware of those were lessons for me. So how do I do this work moving forward? And how do I do it intentionally? How do I do it with thought? How do I do it thinking about folks not taking power from people who succumb to poverty, trauma, violence, sexual abuse, everything? How do I give them power? How do I give them autonomy? How do I give you a say in your own healing? You know, I'm just someone to stand alongside you saying, okay, that's one way to do it. What about this one too? Did that not work? Okay, let's sit here and dig in on this. And it's okay if you get mad and you're triggered. I'm fine with folks being triggered, because that's where the real work happens.
Yeah. I mean, like, you know, the thing that you just said about the power component is so huge, right? Because when we think about, you know, the way that trauma affects us, right? You know, trauma is about power, right? Like, so the experience of trauma, you know, takes away your power. That point of being in a place in which you feel like you've exhausted all of your internal and external resources and your capacity to withstand anything is that point in which the power, the trauma becomes real in your life, right? And so any experience and situation that you find yourself in that resembles that causes that triggering. That, you know what I mean? And that triggering. And it's what you just said, like, understanding that and realizing that this is also this work, this social work, right? This helping profession, this intervention work is really a product of and a mission of helping people recognize and reclaim their power and their possibility in that space, because that's what trauma does. Whether it's like proximity violence of that you've experienced as a result of, you know, guns, you know, or sexual harm. And I want you to talk a little bit about that too, because it's important for people to understand like this connection to like, and I'll share really quickly. So like the sexual harm was something that preceded the other harm that I experienced in my community. Understanding that my community was the way that it was because of all of these structural factors that had like intentionally deprived our communities, I'm talking about Black and brown communities, of the resources, of the opportunities that we needed in order to thrive, right, and to grow in a natural way, right? We're dealing with the war on drugs, we're dealing with mass incarceration, we're dealing with like abject poverty, we're dealing with all of these circumstances. So, you know, I'm not one to be like, oh, my community is violent or my community is this. You know, it's my community was responding to circumstances that took place outside of my community that had an impact. But still, the fact is those things exist in my community. And the sexual abuse and the sexual harm that I experienced preceded that. And by the time I encountered those other situations, I had already been influenced by that sexual abuse in a way that caused me to respond in that fight or flight way, right? And for me, it was the fight. And that fight led to causing harm to other people, experiencing continual harm myself and ultimately incarceration. And so knowing you as someone who's worked extensively with folks who've experienced harm in the community, specifically harm as it relates to gun violence, what's the connection that you've seen as it relates to like sexual harm and sexual violence and like proximity violence and violence that happens in communities that have been impacted by like white supremacy and structural violence?
Yeah. I'll say this, Rich, I'll say this. When I think about violence, this brother I met out in California, he made this really interesting statement. He said, all violence is state sanctioned. And I had to think about it. And I was like, what does he mean by all violence is state sanctioned? And I'm like, it's everything you're talking about. It was the violence we see in communities as a response to the systemic barriers or inequities, all those things, right? In the work, when I think about the work I was doing when it comes to gun violence and trauma and, you know, community violence and everything, the violence that was presented to me, whether it was a young person who had been shot, after doing the work, that was the presenting one. If we understand that there's complexities to traumas, and as you mentioned in your story, of that was the first one, and the sexual violence was one of the first introductions to trauma. And if you have this trauma response, you're starting out with fight or flight, right? Black or white. Life just has to be very concrete. The world is safe or it's not. And so now when I'm in front of somebody, I already know that they're already coming thinking the world in a very like one way or letter friend or foe kind of perspective. My job in that space is to like understand, okay, this is the presenting thing, but there's so much more to you that needs healing, perhaps. And I'm going to create the space for you for that. And by space, I mean in that relationship that we have together. No judgment, not being judgmental, leading with curiosity, and not being time limited. Not saying, oh, you know what, I need to unpack all this in 6 months or 4 or 5 sessions. That's not a realistic expectation. This is a process. I've worked with young folks, with folks who've been with me for a couple years, and we may not even touch on the root trauma, which sometimes can be sexual violence from childhood. There's also when it comes to our communities and their exposure and experiences with like compound trauma. Once again, trauma response is black and white. We got to prioritize what are the things we can navigate first, and then we'll get to that other stuff later. And that also goes back to how men are socialized. We're socialized. Okay, I can talk about the fact that I got shot, I got jumped, or this happened. I can't talk about that stuff that's in the shadows that is really uncomfortable for me to talk about because it's uncomfortable for maybe my community, my family, to even have that conversation.
No, that's it. That's absolutely right. And like, you're right. There's like this, you know, patriarchy and like the masculinity that's toxic that we've internalized really creates this like all of these restrictions around what we can express and discuss with people, right? As men, and particularly as Black men, right? And the fact is, right, like when you think about it, like as Black men, we've already been told, media, all types of images, all types of messages have inundated us with this idea that we are aggressive, that we are hyper masculine, that we are ultimately criminal, right? Which like contributes to the punishing and the encaging of so many Black and brown men, right? And so it's like you said, it's easy for us to talk about that. It's almost a hierarchy. I used to talk about this when I was incarcerated, right? Like there were people there was like a hierarchy of the types of crimes that you committed, the types of acts that you engaged in, right? It was like the murderers was like here, the people who committed armed robbery was like right here. And then like at the bottom is like anyone who did anything that was sexual, anyone who did something that was like against someone that was vulnerable led to this like, you were the like at the bottom of the barrel, and therefore vulnerable and subjected to harm within that space, right? And so a part of what you're describing is also an act of survival, right? It's like, I can't talk about this because if I talk about my sexual harm and my abuse, and we know there's a lot of myths, right? One of the biggest myths is that a person who's experienced sexual harm, specifically a man who's experienced sexual harm, is prone to cause sexual harm to someone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, we've both heard stories of people who say, like, even with your partner, right, when they hear that you've experienced harm sexually, they are questioning whether they should trust their child around you. I've had that conversation, right? Because there's so much misinformation that's circulating around that we accept as the truth that makes people start to, you know, act in accordance, right? And so you're absolutely right. Like, and so for me, I think like that's been like one of the biggest challenges, not being able to identify, and that's why I think sexual harm is so insidious and so impactful, because there's not even a space. That's why men's healing's work is so important. That's why these conversations are so important, because there's never even really been a space for us to acknowledge that type of harm without being perceived as vulnerable, without being perceived as like, you know, potentially going to cause harm to another boy, without being perceived as gay or effeminate. Let's keep it real. Like all of these things.
Yeah.
Right. And so we harbor all of this anger and resentment and pain and trauma. And then we go out into a world that imposes all of this other shit.
Yep.
And essentially it becomes like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. And Rich, to even add to this, Men Healing, we've been around for 20 years. This organization's been around for 20 years. The issue is the lack of access.
Yeah.
For survivors of color, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned these weekends are beautiful. They are powerful. They are transformative for folks. We always say a weekend retreat at Men Healing is worth like a year's worth of therapy for some, right? And come to healing. But you and I also understand that a young survivor who lives in one of our communities that are, you know, over-policed, over-serviced, but under-resourced. And I say over-serviced, meaning there's all types of service providers in there, but it's not resourced appropriately. And they're not having the access. Those young folks are not having that same access. So this is also around how we creating access and how we be mindful of privilege when it comes to how survivors can disclose and feel like they have a space to disclose. Our people in our many folks in our community have so many other things that they have to navigate. This is something that is pushed under the rug. It hides in the shadows. And I think the more transparent conversations that we have like this helps us get to a place where it's no longer in the shadows in our communities.
Absolutely. You know, you make me think of, you know, something as it relates to just like, you know, the fact that like, despite all of these things, and this is why I said that like despite all of these things that we're dealing with, right? Young Black boys and men are still healing, right? We are testaments of like the possibility of healing, right? I'm sitting before you talking about all of the stuff that I've been through. I know you've experienced certain things. Like it's unfortunately the reality that if you are a Black man, Black person, person of color, specifically Black or brown person in this country, you've experienced some form of trauma, some form of violence, whether it's state sanctioned or whether it's interpersonal violence, right? And the fact that we can experience
Let's not forget the microaggressions.
Exactly, right? So, and then that's on a continual basis, right? Like, and so like you experience all of these things, and still, one of the things that I've always noticed about you, personally, is like you smile, bro. I smile. You know what I mean? And like people talk about this hashtag Black Boy Joy, because it's like and it's crazy that we have to even state it in that way and make it a hashtag and make it a movement. But it is really indicative of the reality that like it's amazing for us to be able to still smile.
Yeah. Especially when let's be honest, the framing of is our bodies, our black bodies are viewed as species, right?
Mm,
Compared to, and our bodies are put up against whiteness, right? Whiteness is a norm, ours is abnormal, right?
mm,
And so it's important for us to like, it says first of all, we're resilient as ever
mm-hmm,
as survivors of trauma, being able to be in these spaces and still fight, right? And still push
mm-hmm.
and still try to push the narrative while all these things are continuing to happen. But also, like, that means there is opportunity for healing. And it's for us to look down, pay it forward, like I mentioned earlier. The young people I work with to this day, I still see some of these young men I've been working with for years. And they know that, like, they know that I'll always be there, you know? As a social worker in my job, maybe that's not the right thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? If people didn't do that to me when I was coming up,
Mm-hmm.
I may not be sitting here right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I do what's right.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think about, you know, the parameters of what my job is supposed to be. Because let's be honest, the social service field is part of white supremacy and the patriarchy. So if I'm just going to sit within that and say, this is my job, this is what I'm doing, it puts blinders on us to not do what's right.
That's right.
And survivors, whether it's community violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, they need people to do what's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you're hitting it, bro. Because, like, you know, we know both being in that space, like, all of the efforts that are being done to, like, decolonize this practice of social work, because we don't have the luxury or the privilege to abide by, like, you know, the parameters that this, you know, profession is held within, right? Because our challenges, like, extend beyond those parameters, right?
Yep.
And so we have to. It's almost crazy because it's like we have to, like, you got to go into it understanding that there might be situations and times that you have to break the rules. You understand what I'm saying? Like, one of the things that I say to people is like you can't, right? Because, you know, my interpretation about this whole medical model, the Western concept of, like, psychology and mental health, it's, like, really focused on fixing the individual, right? And when the individual is not fixable because for whatever reason they don't want to, like, comply with what has been described and, like, presented to them as an option, right? Then it's victim blaming.
Yeah.
And so my view has always been, and the message that I've always conveyed is, like, you better be able to have a systems analysis and understand the state-sanctioned violence and the way that they interplay, right? Or you will inevitably engage in victim blaming, right?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, I love being a social worker. I'm proud of it and everything like that. But I also look at the foundation of how this field started, and even how we, like, were out of touch, right? It was well-to-do white women going into the tenements and teaching etiquette classes. So essentially, that's like the root of social work. Going to tenements. Do you think I really need to learn how to use probably use a fork and a knife and a salad fork and everything like that when I'm living in a community that is, plumbing is terrible, early death, all that stuff going on, but we're coming in there completely out of touch. Once again, that hierarchy, like, here's what I can offer you, and we're going to really prioritize this. So I've always been skeptical of the field of social work. And there's always an opportunity to challenge the norms, right? So whenever, like, well, you know, ethically you can't do that. Ethically, I can't do something that I think is right. You know, there's boundaries, but then there's also, like, what's that boundary for? Is that boundary for us? Or is it to kind of, you know, push out the people that we're working for? Right? Like, oh, we don't know, we don't disclose. I'm like, yeah, I don't disclose everything. I'll tell the folks I work with, my clients, my participants that I've gotten to know and build those relationships with, yeah, I love you. But you know you can't come to my house on Thanksgiving. Right. You know you're not getting a gift from me on Christmas Day. You're not under my tree. But I love you as a human being. And I love you for the relationship that I've formed with you and the work we're doing together, this healing work that we're doing together. Because feeling love and feeling that connection is so much more important than any model or treatment modality we do. It is way more important. Being able to connect with someone as a human being is the most important aspect in anyone's healing, especially we know that survivors of all types of abuse, and then we can talk about focus on sex abuse. These survivors talk about feeling isolated on their own, and like no one can understand them. But if I can build that relationship with you and understand, and you know that I'm curious and I'm accepting of you, that is way more than any CBT, TS thing, this kind of treatment, EMDR, whatever. Those are all viable and useful interventions. But if I can't make a connection with you and you feel that I'm looking at you as a human being, as a person that deserves and worthy of being in a space, then none of that is completely pointless.
That's right. That's right. And this is hard work, right?
Yep.
This is hard work that comes from it comes from a visceral, deeper space. But like I love what you said about boundaries, because I think oftentimes we think that we have to like do away with boundaries. But the reality is like we all have to have boundaries in our personal relationships and definitely in our professional relationships, right? And I think boundaries create expectations so people know what to expect, right? Like you say, you're not gonna get a gift under my tree, but you might get lunch, you might get dinner if you're going through some stuff and you might have access to me, right? But I think people respect, and especially young people who've experienced harm, especially young people who are dealing with like circumstances that are byproducts of this state-sanctioned violence that is like led to them being in situations where they're impoverished, like to know that like, yo, I can go to Kenton for this, right? I can't go to him for this, but I can go to him for this, and it will be consistent. That's what boundaries do, right? I know what to expect from Kenton, and I respect Kenton because in so many instances they haven't had boundaries, right? But dang, I knew this was gonna go by super fast.
Right, 7:30.
I want to keep talking. Yeah. And you know it's Taco Tuesday too, so.
Oh yeah.
Yo, man, love you, bro. Thank you
too,
so
Rich.
much for this, man. Thank you for doing this work. Everyone who's listening, it's a minute over, but look, if you have a chance, donate to Men's Healing, because one of the things that Kenton and I are trying to do with Men Healing and Jim, Struvy, and like just the whole team of Men Healing is making sure that this work is accessible, particularly to Black and brown men who are survivors who have not traditionally had access to it. So your donation is going to make that possible, right? Your donation, if we reach that mark of 90,000 people, we'll be able to make this, the Weekends of Recovery, the Day of Recovery, accessible to over 100 men. And my hope is to make sure that as many men of color have access to these healing spaces, this community that I needed, that so many people need in order to heal from sexual harm and violence and all of the other things that we're experiencing. So thank you for joining. Kenton, I'll holler at you later.
Peace
and blessings, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Woo, woo.
Peace.
Peace.